This is a recording mainly about Chapter 2 of our text on the Scaffolding of Rhetoric, but I wanted to go back first for a moment to the dissoi logoi, and just as a reminder, a classification of seeing both sides of an argument. That's why we read that particular text. But more than that, it's a discourse about how meaning and definition are created in the context of a specific audience. And that's the key point, I think, overall for our class this term. But I would also note that ultimately they did try and find a, quote, true meaning for terms such as good and bad. I think you'll notice this as the icon that I've selected for myself for this class. This is Kairos, and the author notes that Kairos relates to the opportune moment. So again, being in a context, deciding when to deliver what parts of the information you have is an important skill to practice, and we'll be able to practice that in the game that we play. Kairos symbolizes seizing that opportune moment, but look carefully at the picture. He's balanced on a ledge, yet ready to take flight while balancing a balance on a knife edge. He has a giant forelock that symbolizes seizing the opportunity. And one other point, I would like to flesh out the definition provided in the text to include taking the appropriate action. So for me, the definition of Kairos is to take the appropriate action at the opportune moment. And you have to think of this as asking yourself these very questions before a meeting or before a class. Not that you just have killer information you're going to use, but how best will you deploy it? And I'll just note in passing this division from Aristotle of the different types of rhetorics, the forensic or judicial, the epideictic or display or laudatory rhetoric, and the deliberative or the legislative. It's good to know this division, but it's not key as they have a lot of overlap. So, for example, you won't see this on an examination, by the way. So here's a paraphrase of what you saw in the textbook on stasis. What happened? What's the harm? Is this the correct place for discussion? And here's the same kind of listing from the BYU Rhetoric website, which you can click on and go to from here. Again, what's useful in thinking about stasis is not to memorize these elements, but to actually put them into play in real situations, whether it's a meeting, a class session, or a family argument. So I want to try to illustrate this by referring to the issue of plagiarism. So plagiarism seems like a straightforward term, and when we look at the initial questions in stasis theory, did he do it? What did he do? It seems pretty straightforward. So if we see a text that has copied language without proper citation, then it seems like a straightforward decision. But to me, that question is much more complicated. Did someone make the action might be clear, but then we look at the evidence, and if the evidence shows us that the person didn't know how to cite correctly, that brings in the question of intent. Was there intent? It also brings in the question of knowledge. Should the instructor have provided or tried to provide more knowledge for the person? Then there's even the question of culture, where in some cultures that are more homogeneous than American culture, the author can assume that the audience knows the background. The information comes from someone else, and so the author is not compelled to cite the information. So when we think about questions of stasis, answering those questions is sometimes more complicated than it first appears. Now let's look at the 5 canons of classical rhetoric, which you can see under the little icon: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And I want to emphasize invention the most. Again, I want to point out that you must involve consideration of your audience. And include the question, what is the actual point of the discourse? And disagreement about what the argument is actually about is an important part of a debate. Stasis theory can help us with invention by asking a few key questions. And one of those important questions is what we mean by the terms we are using. So definition is an important part of argument. Aristotle characterized different ways to help us invent or find content for our arguments, and that's called the topoi, or the topics. And you can find that list of common topics and the list of special topics. The common topics are applicable to most situations, and the special topics are applicable in specific settings. You can search again for these by searching for topics at the BYU website. This will be helpful to you in future writings in the class. And if you click on one of these, for example, here's what you would see under contraries. So it gives you a definition and it gives you examples of a contrary. The author also showed us, as part of the scaffold, the classical arrangement. I emphasize here the introduction. The important thing here to think about in the introduction is putting your audience in a certain frame of mind. And then the third element, the outline, can you actually forecast what's going to occur and in what order? If you can, that's a strong indication that you're organized, and it helps prepare your reader. Providing a forecast is in part what the author talks about when he discusses meta-discourse, or discourse about discourse. That is to help your audience know where they are in the document or in the argument. And on the conclusion, the author is also right. When you indicate that you will end. For teachers, future teachers, this is a basic kind of arrangement. It's kind of reminiscent of the 5-paragraph theme. It's useful to have the 5-paragraph theme in the toolbox, but it's only one tool. There's nothing inherently wrong with a 5-paragraph theme. It just can't fit all writing situations. I'm skipping style, as we have already discussed and practiced that with Gorgias, and I'm skipping memory, as I've already commented on that in class. These are images from a Gilbert Austin 1806 work called Chironomia, or subtitled A Treatise on Rhetorical Delivery. I think you can see here, for example, the precursor of Spock's Live Long and Prosper sign. Of course, movement, gesture, and elocution are key in delivery, and Austin went very much into detail. But I would also ask you to think again about electronic discourse and the capabilities we have in the 21st century for delivery, capability that only a generation ago just giant corporations had, and to think about how broadly we can deliver information across space and time. So we can appropriate the fifth canon delivery in very powerful ways in the 21st century. Now, maybe the most useful elements of the scaffold are the interior and elegant persuaders. When we do not use physical coercion or just data, we can use persuaders that are interior to the person and, I believe, also elegant. Persuasive texts will deploy a combination of these. They work together. The art of rhetoric is how we combine these appeals. For example, if we have many facts at our disposal, it's usually a smart move to begin by building ethos with our audience through an appeal to shared values. The other key points I echo from the author are the macro and micro view of your work and the idea of an implied author and an ideal audience. These ideas work together. If you can picture how you want your audience to see you and to think of you as the implied author, and if you can think of what kind of audience you think you can persuade, that ideal audience, then you can review your text from those perspectives to see if the text overall accomplishes your goals and where the specific wordings are, that micro view, that advance or inhibit your cause. This slide is the best view of the crucial thinking that a rhetor does, as Aristotle says, in the given situation. One last point that takes a separate slide to share. You can find the discussion of Enthymeme on page 51 of the text, and that's compared to the syllogism. In short, the classic syllogism is dialectical logic. That is, it starts with something akin to the truth, those transcendent truths that Plato thought we could access. From there, we can move through deductive reasoning to a conclusion. If only life were so tidy. If we believe that we create truth with a little t, then we depend on the audience to help us create that truth, to make the connections. And we use probability to help make those connections, but we have to think about our audience, what are their beliefs, what knowledge do they have, and what values do they have. So one example to end with. For many years, I've been using physician-assisted suicide in my classes to talk about argument. And I've said over and over that one of my reasons I believe physician-assisted suicide should be legal is that I control my body, I control my person. Nobody's ever challenged me on that and said, what's the connection? So I'm assuming that when I make these two statements, that my audience, because of their knowledge, ideals, values, and beliefs, will make the connection for me. When I say I control my body, my person, I think if I'm in America, I can count on most of the audience having this streak of individualism. In a different culture, I may not be able to assume that. They may have a more social or communal point of view. But what is the connection to that control to legalizing physician-assisted suicide? Can you make that connection, or is it something that I should have to explain? Should I have to supply that middle term for you? So, enthymematic thinking based on probability from your audience is important, and you can be sure that when we start to argue, your listeners will be listening closely to see if you make those connections between your claims and the data that you provide to support them.